Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Classical Education Podcast. This is Brian Freese. Wanted to let you know Adrian will be taking a break, and we will be rebroadcasting some of her favorite and your favorite podcasts from last year. So make sure you have a pen and paper handy. Don't forget to take some notes. We hope you enjoy them.
Today we are here with two wonderful guests that I recently met at a classical education summit in Austin, Texas. Dr. David Rose, Professor of Economics, University of Missouri, St. Louis, Senior Fellow with Common Sense Society, and Dr. Lawrence Reed, President Emeritus, Foundation for Economic Education. Trey and I are very excited to have them here to talk about civics and economics. We think this is a very, very important conversation to have, especially for the emergence of the growth of classical schools. Trey, why don't you go ahead and get us started with our first question?
Yes, very good. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here with us. And I wonder if you could maybe just take us back to the very beginning with some basic definitions here. And I'd love to hear from each of you. Perhaps you could both contribute to a working definition. What do we mean when we use the word civics? And perhaps another definition, what do we mean when we use the word economics?
And who would you like to answer that first?
Either one.
Let me go ahead and go. Civics is defined in a number of ways. My favorite way of defining it is as the study of the rights and responsibilities of citizens in good standing in a society. And I think that actually is a pretty good definition. It's not my definition. It's kind of a standard one. I would add that a crucial part of civics has to do with the instantiation of certain moral and scientific beliefs, moral beliefs about right and wrong, and scientific beliefs about how the world works that need to be inculcated early in life so they operate in what's known as system one thinking. In other words, kind of an automatic, intuitive, unthinking thinking. Like when you see somebody do something that you know is wrong and you immediately feel disgust and that you should enter that kind of thinking. That's a front-loaded kind of thinking. It's a really important part of a society's culture. So one of the reasons why I'm so interested in civic economics is because of my earlier work on culture, where I've given a lot of thought to this idea that what allows us to get along well and harmonize well is due to an early investment by parents into constructing neuroarchitecture very early in life. Most of this work needs to be done before the age of 8. And surely by the time you're into young adulthood, you've lost your window of opportunity where the brain is very, very plastic and receptive to learning. So I see a very tight connection between civics and culture.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Dave with what he said. I see civics as the examination of what it means to be a good citizen. And in my mind, that suggests such things as a good grounding in the history of the polity that you live in. It means some understanding of the basic values that people share within that polity. Some understanding of its literature as well as its governance. What are the governing institutions and how does one participate in those things in a constructive way? All of that is civics education in my book. The second part of Trey's question was concerning economics. And I see economics, and this is not a definition I've come up with, it's kind of a classical definition. It is the study of conscious human action in a world of limited resources. We don't live in a Garden of Eden where you can have as much as you want of anything whenever you want it. A world of limited resources and unlimited wants. So you have a kind of conflict on paper there to begin with. How do you satisfy unlimited wants? Everybody wants whatever they can think of and more of it. How do you satisfy those wants in a world where the resources are limited? And that leads you down the path to a discussion of things like how prices are determined, how markets work, the profit motive, how businesses are structured, profit and loss, and related matters. That's economics, I think, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that actually leads us straight into this idea of cooperation that I heard Dr. Rose sharing about at the summit. Can you take our listeners back to the theme on cooperation that you gave at the summit? And I gathered there that the relationships is what we focus on for a good education model. Tell us how cooperation works in economics.
Sure. Economics traditionally has focused on the nature of exchange between people and that's for good reason. Exchange type behavior, we trade a certain number of dollar bills for a good or one good for another, is pretty unique to humans. There's only really, you have to really stretch your imagination to believe you're seeing true exchange between any other animal other than humans. So we focus on exchange. We focus on the terms of that exchange, which is why market prices are so important, because market prices determine the terms at which we exchange with one another. So that's the centrality of that is important, and it's a super, super important thing that economists did. The problem with that is it basically starts the story of economics too far downstream for people to properly understand. In my view, there are really only two types of transactions that produce benefits to transacting behavior generally that forms the basic unit of analysis of economic behavior. One is the gains from cooperation. One is the gains from exchange. Now, this has been known for a long time. Adam Smith talked about this, but he didn't use these words. He talked about the gains from trade, but in his discussion of the gains from trade, he had a closed story where the gains from exchange and the gains from cooperation were working to reinforce one another in his story. His story is absolutely correct, but it's very difficult for most people to really grasp. And even a lot of economists, if you ask them what Adam Smith's main ideas were, they'll give you, many of them will give you the idea of comparative advantage, which really is more David Ricardo than Adam Smith. So, long story short, the gains from cooperation are very, very simple, and they explain most of the most important social behavior, including pretty much all of the behavior that falls under the auspices of economics. And that cooperation is simply the idea that when we work together, we do better than the sum of the parts. So, alone, I make 10 units of something. Alone, Larry makes 10 units of something. But when we work together, when we cooperate, we make 26. Not 20, which is what your brain expects, 26. By working together, the value of the whole is greater than the value of the sums of the parts. And this is a wonderful thing. And this is why it's good to be human. Humans are really, really good at communication compared to most other species. And so we are able to figure out ways to work together that are simply beyond the ability of most animal species to do. And so we've co-evolved a whole bunch of personality traits and predilections that make us eager to cooperate with each other, which is one reason why we enjoy cooperating with each other, because it's a hugely important thing. So this is, to me, is the foundation of economics, because this is where productive behavior begins. First within the house, and within a hunter-gatherer band, but then later We get so productive. We make more stuff than we can consume ourselves. We think, well, should we just consume more leisure and not work as hard, because we're such good cooperators? That's one thing that we could do. But another thing that we could do is take some of that extra output that comes from our extra productivity and trade it for stuff that we don't have. That's how exchange fuels cooperation. Without enough to trade, there's no trading. So cooperation fuels exchange. So this grand story of economic development is one where gains in cooperation fuel exchange, ever increasing market efficiency makes the value of cooperation grow ever more, makes us try harder to cooperate better, creates more stuff, we exchange more, and it just keeps feeding on itself and feeding on itself. And the people who do the best are the ones that cooperate the best. The people who do the best are the ones that exchange the best. And that humanizes us. That makes us work hard to get along with other people. It makes us cosmopolitan. It makes our lives interesting.
This is interesting. You call it the story of economic development. Is there a good book you recommend to read about this?
Wow. Larry would be a much better person for that question, honestly. Larry, what do you think?
Well, one of the classics of all time is always at the top of my list, and that is Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. He early on explains that in an economic sense, cooperation is always a voluntary thing. You might say, if a thief is pointing a gun at your head and you do what he tells you, you might say, well, you're cooperating with him. But most people wouldn't think of that as cooperation. It's a voluntary thing motivated by the desire on the part of each person to be better off when all is said and done than he was before he engaged in whatever the transaction may be. So economics in one lesson is a good one. Thomas Sowell's, what's his economics text called, David?
Is it Basic Economics?
Basic Economics, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very good too.
I was wondering if you were going to bring up Thomas Sowell in this, because I think we have a lot of Thomas Sowell fans out there.
Oh, great. He's always good on everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I felt like this idea of cooperation was really, really important, because that's obviously what we really want when we are educating our students. We want them to learn that. That's a skill, and it's an art. It's so natural as a human to want to have relationships with other
Yeah.
people. And so learning
It
those.
also frames economics in a totally different way. The way we teach economics normally today is we just dive into the story in midstream with abstract models about how pricing is determined in market. And that's all very interesting to people who have that kind of abstract reasoning mind. But most people don't. And so for most people, this is like painful. However, if you start with cooperation, then all of a sudden economics, by the way, I personally define economics to emphasize that. The standard definition of economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Not wrong with that definition, but it's just kind of empty. It doesn't tell you much, but it's not incorrect. It just doesn't tell you that much. But I personally believe the better definition of economics is it's the study of the mechanisms that facilitates cooperations in large societies. Humans cooperate really well in small groups. It comes naturally to us. It's no big deal. This is one of the reasons why we like life in small groups so much, and we so frequently form small groups to do things. But if you think about it, almost everything in economics is considered part of the modern canon is of absolutely no value to understanding hunter-gatherers. There's no money, there's no markets, there's no assets, there's no banks, there's no interest, there's none of that. Because those things evolve as ways to give us indirect ways to cooperate with each other on massive scales. And so what makes economics so powerful is it allows us to see how cooperation can be effectuated in a multitude of ways at various levels of social strata to tremendous effect that you wouldn't be able to discern from your own personal bilateral behavior. So it's really powerful, but there's no reason for your brain to have evolved any of those mechanisms to appreciate it, because our evolution took place in small groups. So what makes economics cool is what makes it really hard and counterintuitive. But it's
Hmm.
incredibly important because if you get it wrong, you can have millions upon millions of people dying. And this has happened repeatedly in human history where people thought they could do better than letting the market basically work itself out. And they're just wrong. Nobody's that smart.
Hmm. Trey, do you have any questions before we keep? I have more, but I'd like to let you have a chance.
Well, Dr. Rose, you mentioned something in your comments earlier on in our conversation about the importance of children learning something. I can't remember exactly what it was. That's because, um, or that's why I'd like to go back to what you're saying. Something about the importance of them learning something. I think before the age of 8, you mentioned, and then your comments here about small groups, of course, remind me of the importance of the family as it relates to larger economic models. So maybe let's take our conversation for a minute and put it right smack dab at home in the smallest of small groups, the family, and children learning about economics in the life of the home.
Well, I think the family is incredibly important, and I talk about it quite a bit in my most recent book, Why Culture Matters Most. There's this weird problem um, as society becomes more advanced, as we've moved through the modern age and become more efficient and so on and so forth. When it comes to the superficial aspects of the family, it appears that the family is less important than before. I mean, you can imagine in 1720 on the pioneer uh, edge of life, a husband and wife and a couple of kids living in a log cabin, absolutely depend on each other incredibly. They have no chance if they don't function tightly as a family. That's really easy to see. And of course, today it's not unusual at all for somebody to start a family by themselves. And it's not, while it may not be a good idea and you might not approve of it, it certainly can be done and it's certainly feasible. So modern life makes it look like the family isn't as important as it used to be. However, the problem with that thought is it's just dead wrong.
Mhm.
The kind of society that we live in and that we benefit so much from, we are able to benefit from because we have institutions that can exist in our society that cannot exist in most societies. These are institutions, ways of doing things that only work in very, very high trust contexts. Most societies are not high trust societies. Most societies are low trust societies. So many of the things that we do automatically and without thought and with little fear are things that no one would ever bother in most of the world. And yet it's through those very behaviors that we're able to cooperate with one another in ways that make us spectacularly rich. So what does that have to do with the family? If you want to have a very high trust society, the only way you can have it is to have a critical mass of highly trustworthy people.
Mhm.
And if you want to have highly trustworthy people in society, so much so that it's irrational to presume a randomly drawn stranger is untrustworthy. Yeah, the joke's on you. You're not engaging in as many positive transactions as you could because you're being too cynical, right? If you want to have that high of a number, the only way to achieve that is to have very intense teaching and operant conditioning of moral beliefs that strongly support steadfast trustworthiness, to teach children you don't lie, you don't cheat, you don't steal. It's wrong. It's categorically wrong. We're not going to talk about weighing the elements or whatever. This is just stuff you don't do. It's a matter of your character in
Mhm.
the sense of Aristotle. It needs to be a part of who you are. You need to be a trustworthy person, not because it's a good idea, not because it's prudent, but because it is wrong to not be, and it is right to be. And you should feel good about yourself when you know you're a trustworthy person. This needs to be driven into children at a very young age and reinforced over and over again so that as they grow older with their friends, they can't help but notice that their friends are kind of echoing the same thing. Because
Mhm.
if they don't see that consistency, they'll very quickly understand that they are chumps, that they're playing a game one way, everyone else is playing the game the other, and they're always on the losing end. And that is incredibly demoralizing and unraveling. we have found no mechanism in the history of mankind that can adequately substitute for the family to intensely inculcate those kinds of beliefs and reinforce them. There might be a mechanism, it's possible. We just have never found one yet. And I really doubt that it's going to be there, because raising a child to have a very strong ethical character, one that produces somebody who's just, unthinkingly, System 1, Daniel Kahneman, unthinkingly trustworthy, that's very hard work. And it also requires that the parents not only work hard to put it in there, the parents also have to be very, very careful to never, ever set the wrong example and ever be revealed to be hypocrites. And this is just very, very difficult.
Yeah,
People will do that with their children, but they won't do that with everyone else.
this is moral education with your children. Reading stories to them. I have I have this little toddler book I read to my kids. It's called Danny and the Candy Bar, and Danny steals a candy bar, and the mommy takes him back to return the candy bar. And I read that story to my children before they were 5, and then it happened. And one of my kids stole a candy bar, and then they told me after they ate it, and I made them go back to the store and pay for the candy bar and apologize,
Mhm.
And I think it's just as simple as that, is a simple little way of getting that truth into a child.
A few years ago, there was a great movie that came out, maybe a decade or more now, called Cinderella Man, starring Russell Crowe, and it's based on the true story of the boxer James Braddock. And there's a scene in that movie, Adrian, that reminds me of, or that you reminded me of with that example. In the midst of the Great Depression, when the family is down and out and has virtually nothing, and they're wondering if they can hold everything together, one of the young boys steals a sausage from a butcher and comes home with it. And that's a big test of what will the parents do. And Russell Crowe, playing James Braddock, takes the boy back to the grocer and has him return the sausage and apologize. And then outside on the sidewalk, with the two of them eyeball to eyeball, he says to him in a way that he'll never forget. He said, "We don't steal. Doesn't matter how little we have. Doesn't matter how much somebody else has. We don't steal. Have you got that?" And then the boy says, "Yeah." And to drive it home, Russell Crowe says, "Are you sure? Do you really have it? You got it?" And I thought, wow, what a lesson. That boy probably never forgot that.
Yeah, and there's another good story that's for little children, if parents listening need an idea. Benjamin Franklin and his whistle.
Hmm.
He had, his mom had given him a penny or something like that. A 10, isn't it 10 penny whistle or something like that? It's been a while since I read it. But there's a poem version and there's a prose version. And that story, you read that to children, and then at the end you're like, well, did he make a good choice? Because I think the whistle broke or something, and he realized he just wasted his money in a bad choice, a bad purchase choice, And so there's lots of little stories I think you can read to children
Oh,
that will.
stories are so important. If you just lecture to kids, this is especially true the younger they are. They only remember so much, but if you can impart the values that you have in mind by way of real life stories, I think that's what they remember.
Yeah,
If I can offer a
Yeah, go
commercial
ahead.
for my book yet again, stories, I quite agree stories are important. And in Why Culture Matters Most, I actually have a whole section of a chapter on stories and why they're so important. And my argument, and I still believe this argument, is that one of the reasons why we love stories so much, we love to tell them, we love to hear them, and we also, particularly children, you'll notice, love to learn stories with repetition. They particularly like to hear the same story. They like to watch the same movie over and over again, hear the same story over again. So why is this is clearly genetic? Because it is clearly universal. All humans love stories. And so why is that? And my argument is this is a testament of the importance of culture, because we don't inherit culture genetically. Not one bit of it. It actually would contradict culture. Culture is that which is transferred from generation to generation through teaching and learning, not through genes explicitly. So the stories our love of stories is rooted in it providing a mechanism through which this essential content of ideas, things about right and wrong, things about how the world works, pearls of wisdom. Some of it's about prudence, some of it's about morality. It's all over the place, but all this stuff's important. Where we learn this stuff in a way that is committed to memory in a deep kind of way. And so I think Larry's quite right. Stories are everything. I have a friend who's a pretty famous writer, and he's often said, you know, I told him this first, but then he says it back to me like I've never heard it before, which is people hate a lecture and people love a story.
Yeah.
And it's true. So if you're a professor, the best thing you can do is to present your material as much as possible in the context of the story. And that's exactly what I try to do in how I teach economics, and that's how I teach it differently. I teach it along the timeline of history as a story about us, from our, you know, our first genetic instantiation all the way to the present. So the story of sapiens since sapiens existed, and that's what's going on. Well, that draws people in because they feel like you're watching a Nova episode or something. It's way more interesting than supply and demand. So supply and demand make an appearance, but they make an appearance in a context that's already rolling forward to a grand story of the big picture. And I think that is something that economists, I don't know about an F, but maybe a D plus is the grade they get in terms of how most economists teach most of economics.
So we've been talking a bit about how the family is important in terms of that function of passing down morals and ethical framework. And I think we could go on some time discussing that idea further. I wonder if we could also talk about other practices that have traditionally found themselves in the home. I'm thinking of an essay that I read some years ago by a professor by the name of John Cutterback. And the essay, if anyone wants to look it up, is titled "The Economics of Splitting Wood by Hand." And it's a lovely essay in which this contemporary philosopher professor talks about his love of splitting wood. And I like to do this as well. And so I enjoyed coming across this essay. And at some point, he is approached by a neighbor or a friend, I can't remember which. And this person asks him, he says, "John, what you're doing is not economical, right? Why don't you just buy the wood? You could be spending your time working on your next book, or you could be spending your time doing any number of different things that would seem to make a lot more sense from an economic standpoint." And of course, Dr. Cutterback goes on to explain how there is so much more value beyond simply the monetary value of the wood that he is splitting or could otherwise purchase in his time, but also the time he's spending with his son. And the quality time that's spent there, and the what he's passing down in terms of the value of hard work. I think he makes the point about how splitting wood warms you twice, right? Both when you're splitting it and when you warm it. So what I'm saying here is that there are some things that seem to be just very humane that are built into the life of a family, at least when we think of some of the traditional things that have gone on within, let's call it home economics. And then there's also some things that I think are distinctly Christian, and some things that we've inherited from our Jewish heritage and Greek philosophy. Certain things that relate to, well, for example, I'm thinking of the Jewish practice of how they would save the edges of the field for the poor to come in and collect, to provide for the community that way. And I think from some perspectives, that seems like a really bad economic model. So I wonder if you could speak to some of the ways in which our understanding of economics sort of fits in with what it means to be human and how we understand what it means to be human through the classical tradition?
Well, I'll tackle that by saying at the outset that we should not view economics as everything in life. It goes a long way in explaining the conscious decisions we make to engage in trade with other people. And that's a big part of life, but there's so much more to life than what is purely economic. You talked about some of the virtues that are enhanced by the man splitting wood with his son. To that list, I would add self-discipline. I think that's a very important character trait that we should seek to instill in our young people at an early age. The idea that if you really want to accomplish a task, you have to kind of stick to it. You have to refrain from the engaging in distractions that might set you off course. The whole act of self-discipline, I think, is a very healthy practice, and it's really it does have economic implications, of course. I think the more self-disciplined people tend to be the more successful economically, too. If you're flying off the handle at every little thing that comes along and going in a million directions and never focusing, you're probably not going to be a very good business person or transactor with other people in the marketplace. You got to focus and be self-disciplined to a significant degree. So there are a lot of factors involved in life that don't come under the rubric directly of economics. Love and respect and gratitude are among those features of life that may not be directly economic in nature, but they sure are important. The last one I just mentioned, gratitude. I think we underestimate all too often how important it is to have a grateful spirit. There was a bioethicist some years ago who, by the name of Emmons, who wrote a book on this issue, revealing the results of some studies that he and his colleagues had done on what a grateful spirit can do for a person's life. And their conclusion was that having a grateful spirit can add as much as 7 years to your life. And that's really nothing more than understanding and appreciating and practicing the idea that good things that happen to you in life are not entirely due to you, that good things happen often because other people are involved. And sometimes they're doing good things for you, even though that's not their direct intent. As Adam Smith told us, entrepreneurs, merchants, business people, they don't go to the business of taking risks and making investments and hiring people and paying bills and producing goods because they like you. They don't even know you in most cases. They do it because there's something in it for them. Because in a free society, if you want to progress, if you want to do better, if you want to have a higher income, you got to find ways to serve other people and offer them things that they'll buy willingly, hopefully not just once, but many times. So, yeah, there are a lot of things that aren't just economic, but are very critical to a wholesome life.
Mhm. One of the themes I'm hearing here is how important moral virtue, character is for a free society. And what I'd like to hear from both of you is some good examples of good and bad characters that have affected civics and economics in history, in story. What are who are some of these characters that have affected good and bad that we ought to be introducing kids to in even in what grades, like from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade?
Yeah.
Because teachers need to have practical examples of resources and where can they turn to help teach this to children in their
A
classroom?
lot of the stuff is already out there and is already known. What's lacking is the ability to tie it to the proper context.
Hmm.
So in other words, everyone knows about Aesop.
Hmm.
You know, everybody knows that many of his fables involve various elements of wisdom, but a lot of it is about prudence. Prudence is extremely important, right? But what very few people appreciate is the role that cultivating a virtue of prudence in an individual and cultivating the virtue of prudence in the vast majority of individuals. So if you have a population with a critical mass of prudence, how indispensable that is for the society to function well. If you want to scale it up, suppose you have a society with people who've never been taught anything about prudence. They're very base. They're just looking out for number one, and they don't think ahead very much. They're very mentally undisciplined, and so on and so forth. They live in a very large society, and it happens to be democratic. Well, that's going to be mob rule real quick, and it's just not going to work out. A democracy is a lovely thing, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to sustain. If you want a democracy, you want all the joys of democracy, and I do, you've got to do the hard work up front. And the hard work up front comes through people like Aesop. But the key is to take these people that we know from literature and so on, and show how what they did fits into this broader paradigm of what it takes, not just to build the perfect beast as an individual who can contribute to society, but also to sustain those institutions at the macro level with such people.
Wow. So it almost sounds to me like high schoolers should be reading Aesop's fables in their economics class.
That wouldn't be such a bad idea in an effort to
Sure.
square the circle.
Right.
But of course, they should be reading Aesop, more like third grade.
But come back
and
to
that
it.
should be done.
Yeah,
Sure.
come back
You're
to
right.
Mhm.
I quite agree.
Yeah. And Larry, Lawrence?
That's all right. Either one will do. Well, like Dave, I have a book of my own I'd like to recommend in this regard because it pertains precisely to what we're talking about. And it's called Real Heroes, and it's 40 chapters. Each one you can read in 10 or 15 minutes. Each chapter is about a heroic figure in the past who lived a life of character. And many cases, they didn't always live a life of character. They may have had an epiphany at some point and became a better person. That's the case more often than not. But students, I think, going back to what we said about stories, a great story is about a real person who actually lived, who exemplified the very qualities you're trying to instill. The very first chapter in my Real Heroes book is about Cicero. And of course, he's very important to any classical educator. And he exemplifies one of the most important virtues, I think, of good citizenship, and that is the courage to speak truth to power. The courage to make truth so important that you speak it at every opportunity, that you don't try to sweep it under the rug or prevaricate or lie. And, you can lecture to students about that, but if you can say, hey, let me give you an example of somebody who literally put his life on the line and lost it, in fact, because he stood for truth and speaking truth to power. But you can't say that he lived a wasted life, even though he lost it, because look at the example he is to people today who are still reading about him 2,000 years later and finding great inspiration in his life. If you have a class of students and you have some minority students present, or even if you don't, I'd say just be careful that you tell stories that appeal to people of every background. And so, for instance, when Black History Month rolls around in February, if I'm speaking somewhere, I like to bring up some of the great heroes of Black America in the last 200 years. And sometimes when we focus on heroes of Black America, we put all the emphasis on civil rights activists. And that's, there's a story there that should be told. But don't forget the entrepreneurs, people like Elijah McCoy. Here was a guy who was the son of slaves. He had very little to go on when he struck out in life. He went to work at a railroad, but he was alert and observant. And he noticed that the railroads in those early days had a real problem. They couldn't go very far before you had to stop the locomotive and lubricate it, or otherwise it would overheat. Well, he ended up inventing a lubricating cup that allowed the railroads to send those locomotives a lot further down the track, a lot more efficiently. And he became a very wealthy businessman, marketing not only that, but other things that he earned 50 some patents. Well, we should be talking about such great people, black or white or any other color, male or female, because those are the people who actually solve problems. You know, if you just talk about problems and complain about them, I don't know how much you really do to solve them. But if you're out there creating new wealth and providing employment and fixing problems that everyday people wrestle with, you've done a wonderful service for humankind. And we should emulate those great producers and inventors of wealth.
Yeah, that's really good.
Mm.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about self-governance as well. Like, how do you think classical schools need to encourage self-governance? What changes in your experience with classical schools need to happen in order to raise students who can self-govern? We know it's important. It's an important topic in this discussion. But if kids are being spoon-fed, lectured,
Yeah.
and having their hands held, how can the parents and teachers shift their current practices to focus on helping students learn the critical habit of self-governance?
Well, I would certainly start by emphasizing with any audience, young or old, that governance per se is not an option. The way I like to put it is if you do not govern yourself, you will be governed. And what I mean by that is that if, as a people, we fail to corral our worst motives and instincts, learn to live peacefully with other people, learn to respect lives and rights and property and contracts of other people, then we have a chance at great progress, material, economic, and spiritual and artistic, all kinds of doors open for us if we learn that essential lesson. But governance, we too often think of it as purely something that government does, that other people that got elected somehow do to us. But I think it really starts at home. You have to govern yourself. And then if you're good at that, then you're qualified, I think, to have something to say about how the society at large is governed as an elected official or an employee of government. I mean, I'm one who wants to keep that kind of government small and manageable. But I also understand that it's necessary in order to keep the peace. So I start with self-governance. That's if you don't have that, then you're going to have some other government tell you what to do at every turn, and get the students to understand the distinction there, and get them to understand the importance of right conduct, because bad conduct invariably leads to trouble for yourself, trouble for society, and probably the kind of government that few people outside of it really want. But that's what they're going to get if they're a bunch of bad apples.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love Larry's point, and I don't like the fact that he stole it from me before I had a chance to make it. But that's one of the hazards of being on a panel. But I want to extend it a little bit. This idea that governance is not an option is absolutely correct. It's going to exist. The question is, how is it going to exist? So the key idea there is that self-governance and top-down governance are substitutes. You know, where you are on the range just depends upon how much investments you put in there. And I would like to point out that one of the reasons why so many people are enthusiastic about homeschooling and classical education and so on and so forth is it's a response to the growing recognition that there's a growing number of people in education who I think for the most part unwittingly have been duped into carrying the water for people who seek to infantilize the public. They prefer people to think at kind of a child kind of level. They prefer people who lack the ability to self-govern because they prefer a world where government provides the order from the top down because they hope to volunteer to provide that order, to be the ones who move the power. So I know that sounds kind of cynical, and it would be if it weren't true, because it is true, and that's
It
the
is
way it is.
true. Yeah, you're
And
right.
children need to know that. Children need to know that when people are teaching you what you want to hear and removing the consequences of your actions, they are helping to cultivate a person that will readily accept pseudo parentage from the government later in life as an adult when they shouldn't be, because that's what they want. And that brings me to my second point about self-governance. How do you get self-governance? One of the most important things for getting self-governance is something that has become quite rare these days, and it's dangerous, and that is people have to be able to fail.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's when you fail, and you fail big, and it's on you. And other people might be, I mean, they're not going to let you die, but otherwise they're going to, you know, they expect you to kind of bear the cost of your failure and make it right. Your brain is very impressed by the experience, and it doesn't want the experience to happen again. And you get better at thinking carefully about how to think ahead about what you do, which is what self-governance is all about. It pays to be the person who nips and tucks his own behavior rather than is responding to the consequences of it. Just avoid those consequences by getting it right up front. That's the essence of it. Now, think about how much in modern K through 12 education, and even at the college level, it's run rampant now.
Mm-hmm.
That everything is geared towards making it as easy as possible for students to learn. All of the burden is being put on the professor and the system because all children can learn, so it's your fault if they don't. They've come to expect this. This is exactly what you would expect of people who would prefer not to have partners in societies, but prefer to have subjects. And our students need to know that when you hear this stuff, it's like somebody feeding M&Ms to a child so that they can become a diabetic by the time they're 30. It's not good stuff. These are bad people. Good people will let you have a few M&Ms every now and then, but for the most part, you're supposed to eat your green.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. There's a lot of different directions we could go here. I'm reminded of Plato's warnings about the extremes of democracy. And I don't know if we have time to delve into that too much, but, you know, this idea that, you know, that the will of the people will ultimately, you know, if they're just sending representatives that are just sort of giving them what they want versus what they need. And I'm putting this in very simple terms, but that's something that I would encourage people to look into, because all this is connected, right? Our economics is connected with our political systems, and it all goes back to the life of the family and the home. And you know, if mom and dad are just giving, you know, Johnny and Susie whatever they want, whenever they want it, you know, those are the beginnings of certain expectations, right? And certain demands that they may then try to live out on a larger scale in society. But I find it interesting that both of you gentlemen, when asked for recommendations, went back, right? Went back in time to Aesop and went back to Cicero. I would like to add Dante to the list, right? I can't remember which canto it is there in his work in the Inferno, but he has a whole section of hell devoted to the sin of usury.
That's right.
Which I think a high schooler should be reading alongside the study of economics, it would seem. So I just wanted to point out that both of you referred back to a historical text. And I wonder if we could talk to the teachers who are currently teaching a civics class. We don't want to forget our civics conversation. And those who are teaching a high school economics class, let's say, who are tempted to primarily work with the headlines or whatever it is that's going on in contemporary society, right? The current conversation, let's say, versus the classical approach, which is really not to be immediately concerned, at least not in the classroom, with those things, but rather to go back to an older story and to show examples and read where people have already wrestled with these things in the past. Maybe we could talk about the importance of not spending all of our time operating with the current headlines when we teach these subjects.
I think that's important, Trey. I probably, if I were teaching a class today, and somehow this general area came up, I think I'd want the students to understand that it is not the hallmark of a good citizen to think of those who came before as not worth spending time with. I mean, just ask a student today, hey, if you don't think that people who went through life in the years past and wrestled with all kinds of problems are worth paying some attention to, well, you're only condemning yourself, because someday you're going to be the past. And do you want people of the future to look back and say, oh, those folks in 2022, what could they possibly know? Let's pay them no attention. I don't think we'd want to be treated that way. And then when you start to look at the great people of the past and the great books of the past, you begin to find, wow, they really did have something to offer. And human experience didn't just begin the day you were born. There's a lot that came before that is worth studying. In fact, we all know the famous line from the philosopher George Santayana, those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. There's a lot of truth to that. There's not a whole lot in the world today that hasn't, in some form, with different personalities on the stage, happened before. And if that's the case, well, then we ought to be asking ourselves, what are the lessons from those past experiences that apply today? I think a good person, a good citizen, should always keep one eye on the past, because it offers more answers and more guideposts than most people give it credit for.
I'd like to first answer the question that I thought you were about to ask, even though you didn't, because I wanted about a book that's more modern, that would deal with some of these issues at an admittedly more macro kind of level, but still, I think would be important reading. And that's Tom Sowell's A Conflict of Visions, which is, I think it's a masterpiece. I think it is brilliant. It is so well written. It's so compelling. It's so easy to digest. And it rings so true. And it would give students an opportunity to get a sense of how you might organize your thoughts and make sense of what we see there. I think that the idea of this, the question you did ask, though, was a really good question about, this idea, oh, well, this stuff in the news and issues and so on and so forth. Why don't we just deal with that? Well, that's I would call that bumper sticker pedagogy. And usually bumper sticker, fill in the blank, is pejorative, right? You don't say something's bumper sticker and you mean it's bumper sticker pedagogy. And let me give you an example of how pathetic it is, and therefore how important classical education is. We are where we are as a result of literally thousands of years of evolution, of ideas, thoughts, policies, institutions, culture, and that feeding on itself with countless losers and dead ends, okay? That was an incredibly complex process that was fueled by some of the smartest human beings to ever live, who worked as hard as anybody ever worked. And thank God they went to all that trouble, or we wouldn't have what we have today. So when somebody says, oh, the way we should teach this class is through current events, my first thought is to say, why don't we just go to somebody who doesn't know any chemistry whatsoever and throw the most complex stoichiometry problem at them and just say, well, what do you think it is? And now they can come up with something, and they can move some letters around and some numbers and say, well, that looks good. But it is a pathetic, superficial treatment, because unless they've learned about atoms and protons and work their way up through the steps, because there's so much content before you get to that margin of conventional issues, unless you do that, you are just filling dead time with hot air. It's
Hmm.
just pathetic. So it isn't just that in the past there were things that we dealt with and we can learn from it. The very ideas are layered. They're not perfectly axiomatic, but they kind of are. There's a lot of stuff you can't know here if you don't know here, and a lot of stuff here you can't really know if you don't. And that's just the way it is. And I know, okay, that's terrible. It means you got to do a lot of work in order to really understand something. That's just the way it is. That's just, if you don't like that, you don't want to be an educated person, because that's what it takes. So we need to make our students understand, our teachers understand, that the most crucial ideas for sustaining a free market democracy are some of the most difficult and subtle ideas we have. I mean, after all, why weren't we doing this 80,000 years ago? I mean, we've had the current genome for over 120,000 years, and our most immediate ancestors were very nearly as smart as we are. What were we waiting on? Well, we weren't waiting on anything. That those ideas are the actual substrate of the good life. It's every bit as important as iron ore is to steel. It just is. If you don't have the one, you don't get the other. And those are just the hard facts. But that stuff that seems so remote and dated and so on is, the farther back you go, the more uncool it is and the further away it is from current events. But the more accessible it is, because it's involving a world that's still simple enough that even a child can at least wrap their mind around the issues that somebody like Aristotle is talking about.
Yes. I think both of your answers are spot on. And Adrian, please forgive me for butting here yet again. But another question that comes to my mind, just because reflecting on my own teachers that I have sat under in high school, in an economics class or a history, civics class, and then ones that I've just seen sort of in my career as a teacher. I think this is a big temptation, right? Each teacher in his or her area of study has a temptation, and I think the current events approach is a major temptation for teachers of these subjects. I think another temptation and another thing that, and the fact that I'm describing is a temptation, I'm showing my cards here, but something that's being currently debated right now, speaking of current events, here we go, is this question of, well, shouldn't we be making time in high school in particular for very practical classes in which we teach students how to, well, they used to say balance a checkbook, but I guess they don't say that anymore. You know, how to manage their bank account, how to pay their taxes, how to buy a home, all these things that it seems, at least from the feedback, loop, that a whole generation of people seemingly don't know how to do very well. At least that seems, if you just kind of jump into the world of social media, that seems to be the what a lot of people are saying. And as a classical educator, I just find myself being very protective of the time and space in which we have with students. And I just wonder where all of that fits in, and if that's not something that really ought to come as sort of something that's built on top of what I would hold to be much more fundamental principles and stories, even from our past, that help them understand something more than just the mere practical application of certain practices.
Well, certainly you can go overboard in these subject areas like balancing a checkbook and teaching young people about things they're going to have to deal with. If that sort of thing comes at the expense of teaching the fundamentals, such as how to critically think, how to add and subtract and multiply and divide, then I think you're wasting time. Nobody ever taught me how to balance a checkbook, by the way. I just learned that. I think that's something,
Right.
as a teacher, I would say, I don't think I have to teach you that. You'll learn that. You'll learn that pretty quick. The first time you overdraw your account, you'll learn how to balance that checkbook. Let's focus instead on something Cicero said. That would seem to me to be a lot more profitable. But and some of these things too used to be, I think, more commonly taught at home. We learned so much more at home when parents regarded the education of their children as a priority. But we've been telling them now for 100 years, oh, no, that's not your job. You're not qualified. The experts have to do that in the professional government-owned, government-run classrooms. So you just keep out of this and let them do their job. And so some of these simple things that kids would learn when parents took time out to teach them, I guess we were having to do some of that in even the higher grades, but that's not where it ought to happen. That's not the purpose of formal classroom education. Shouldn't be in it anyway.
I would like to expand a little bit on Larry's point. This is yet another example of the margin of the family and the family serving as a substitute, and something else trying to substitute for the family. And why would we want that? Well, if you want to run societies from the top down, the last thing on earth you want are strong families inculcating values and creating a sense of self-discipline and self-starting. So you got a whole bunch of people who can think for themselves, and when they hear nonsense, cock their head and say, I don't think that makes any sense, and actually articulate a meaningful criticism. You don't want that. What you want are people who just want stuff done for them. Interesting story about the checkbook. I learned how to figure out my own checkbook because there's actually instructions from the bank on how to balance a checkbook. They're right there. And so that's how I did it. And then I, like many young adults, I was, I guess, 17 by the time this happened. I was lazy and sloppy and so on. And I got my checkbook all screwed up, and it was incredibly embarrassing and humiliating. So what then happened? Who then made sure I really learned how to do the check?
Self-governance here.
Yeah.
It was my mother.
Oh, okay.
My mother, by the way, who was in my family. My mother, who did not even go to high school. Now, she didn't learn how to balance in high school. Of course, they didn't teach that stuff back then anyway. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Why? Because my mother did know how to read. That was her ACE card. And she had learned how to balance. And I'll bet you at some point she screwed her checkbook up too. Mm-hmm. And she understood, you just got to be disciplined about this or you're going to really regret.
Right. The ripple effect of bounce checks.
And it never happened again.
Oh, I bet it didn't.
Never again. Thanks, Mom.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're out of time, but I feel like I could keep going. And I really want our listeners to respond to this by posting questions like on our Facebook page. And maybe we can email you guys some questions or have you back on again. We always end with a concluding question, and I'm going to let Trey ask that. But before we do, I did want to ask, are there any other resources you would recommend for high school teachers to use in the classroom?
I'll recommend my website.
Sure. What is it?
Well, it's only because there's a lot of history and economics and political thought and in the blog section of the website. It's lawrencewreed.com, LAWRENCE, middle initial W, last name REED, Lawrence W. Reed, no punctuation, lawrencewreed.com, sorry.
Yeah, and we'll put that in the show notes too.
Okay, thank you.
So what kind of resources are on your website?
Everything I write, which often is heavily historical. There's a lot of Roman history, a lot of British history, and as well as American. There's a lot of economics. There's some commentary on current events. But again, I'm more of a fan of learning from the past than I am from dealing with the politics of the moment. But so people will find, and there's a good search engine on it, so people can find almost anything they're looking for in history anyway.
Okay. Do you have anything to recommend, David?
Not really. I wish I did. The reason why I don't is because I have such a radically different way of doing things that I'm always trying to get my own ball going. And so I don't really spend that much time looking at the content that's out there to try to pick what I like the most.
Hmm.
I just teach stuff my own way, which basically requires me to make this stuff up or draw it directly from history on my own. So a lot of it ends up being economic history.
Right. And a lot of classical schools hire content experts. So if they're hiring somebody that has a degree in civics and economics, then that person ought to know what are the good texts to bring into the classroom. I think I'm interested in this A Conflict of Vision by Thomas Sowell that you recommended. Is this something that high schoolers can read?
Absolutely. There's only a few books that have really made a big impression on me, and this is one of them.
Hmm.
It's right up there with books like Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which
Hmm.
is a must. Yeah, another book that's kind of like that I think is incredibly important is Robert Frank's Passions Within Reason, wrote way back in 1988, which was actually a very, very influential book, an incredibly important book about how economists get the topic of trust all wrong and why getting it right is so important and what's the right way to think about trust. And I think he's about 80% right. And he was way ahead of his time. And that book was one of the inspirations behind my first book, which was The Moral Foundation of Economic Behavior.
So would those books be appropriate for high schoolers to read or the teacher to read as a resource?
Selfish Gene high schoolers could read. Passions Within Reason might be more for the teachers.
Hmm.
But I
Adrian,
think the conflict of visions of seniors could certainly read it.
Okay.
Adrian, I just thought of three others that would be good for any age, actually. And they relate to an area we've touched on but haven't gotten into in great detail, and that is the area of self improvement. Um, one is a classic by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. All these decades after it was written and revised, I think, many times, it still remains one of the best books for improving yourself that is out there. And a more recent one is by a woman named Olivia Cabane, Cabane, and it's called The Charisma Myth. And I found that book to have a gem on every page. If you want to know, how can I make myself a better person in a way that others will learn from and seek to listen to, that kind of thing. That's a great one. And the third, is called The Memory Book. I almost forgot the title. The Memory Book. It's a classic in memory training. Anybody can read it, and it's by Jerry Lucas
Hmm.
and Harry Lorraine. The Memory Book. Oh my gosh, I couldn't put that down. And one result of it was I used to memorize within 10 minutes a class of 75 students and do that 5 times in a day to 5 different classes and call them all off by name thereafter. And the students, I discovered they work twice as hard for you if they think you really know them.
Yeah. That's great. These are great. So Trey, why don't you go ahead and close with our last question?
Right. Well, I think both of you addressed the question of books that you would recommend. But there's a bit of a twist on this one, which is, well, I'll give you 2 options. You can either mention a quote that has a resonating impact on your life, or perhaps a book that you wish you had read sooner in your life. Perhaps, Dr. Rose, you could go first.
That's a pretty hard question. A quote. I don't want to have one off the top of my head. A book that I wish I had read sooner. That's a little easier. And that would, I hate to sound like I'm beating the same drum, but I didn't read A Conflict of Visions until I was in my 30s. If I had read that when I was in high school, it would have really changed things for me. When I was an undergrad, I had to take a graduate level political theory and philosophy course, and I was furious about it. I thought it was going to be the stupidest waste of time ever in my life because I was all math science guy, and why would I do this? And it turned out to be like my favorite class of all time. I was just blown away. And if I had read something like A Conflict of Visions as a high school senior, I wouldn't have had to wait until I was 2 years into my undergraduate degree to see the joy of struggling through literature written by some of the smartest humans to ever live, who are working as hard as anybody has ever worked to try to help us organize society in a way that can give us the good life. I mean, there can't be a higher calling than that. You're simply trying to make a better world for your fellow man today and tomorrow. But I never did get to read Conflict of Visions at that time. So that would be that's my commercial for Conflict of Visions. Thomas Sowell will be happy to hear that I plugged this book 3 times.
I know he is an avid listener to our podcast.
There you go.
Oh, great.
Yeah, maybe if anybody has connections, that'd be great. We all admire him very much.
I'll close with a quote, and it's one of my very favorites. And the truth of it is unbelievably profound, so profound that if the world could come to understand it, there would be so much less mischief. But it's from the Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek, Hayek. And he said, the curious task of economics is to convince men of how little they know about what they imagine they can design. Think of that. The curious task of economics is to convince men of how little they know about what they imagine they can design. The world is just full of busybodies and know-it-alls. People who run around, they haven't solved their own problems. They haven't fixed their own lives yet. They haven't had time to do that because they're too busy trying to fix everybody else, trying to plan the lives of other people. Well, Hayek, in this quote, says, even the smartest person in the world is nowhere near as smart as he thinks he is.
I have a quote for you that follows up on Hayek if you want one. If you're really aching for a quote.
Yeah.
Arthur Kessler. Philosophy is far too serious a matter to be left to philosophers.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I take that as, there's a lot of ways to take that, but to me, what that said, it isn't so much a swipe at philosophers as it is a swipe at us for us not taking philosophy seriously enough. We need to get in the game of that. We can't just let them worry about that stuff, because that stuff affects how people vote, affects our ability to self-govern as a society and as an individual.
Thank you guys so much for this. This was so delightful. I never thought I could ever say that economics was delightful because, of course, my experience in high school was a boring lecture-based approach. I didn't have a classical education. So this was really, really fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Adrian, Trey, Dave. I've enjoyed it very much too.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky They will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven.